Defense News is proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, we'll find out who President Trump's pick is to lead the Air Force, see the agility of Bell's V-280 Valor, and look at the future of the Navy's carrier air wings. With in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis, this is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm Jeff Martin. We've got some great interviews and stories for you this week, including the future of the Navy's carrier air wings, an inside look at a vital nuclear security mission, and we'll also hear directly from a mysterious Air Force figure, Colonel Ned Stark. But before we do that, here's some headlines. President Trump has made his pick to become the new Secretary of the Air Force, announcing yesterday via tweet that he would nominate Barbara Barrett, a former diplomat and former chair of the nonprofit Aerospace Corporation. If confirmed, Barrett would replace Heather Wilson, who will take over the University of Texas, El Paso. Barrett, who's from Arizona, served as ambassador to Finland under President George W. Bush and is a pilot herself. She was actually nominated for the Air Force job in 2003, but withdrew before the process really began. And Bell's V-280 Valor, one of two participants in the Army's Joint Multi-Role Demonstrator Program, has finished low-speed agility maneuver testing. Bell says this is the final key performance parameter needed to prove the tilt rotor's capability. This comes about a year and a half after the aircraft's first flight and after many other tests were conducted. As for what's next, Bell says they'll continue to test different concepts and technologies. The other entry, the Sikorsky and Boeing SB-1 Defiant, flew for the first time earlier this year. And Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan is in hot water with both sides of the aisle in Congress after putting out a new policy that restricts what information about international military operations, and particularly special operations, can be released to the legislature. The memo appears to have been inspired by concerns that Congress would not safeguard military plans, but House leaders have called that inexcusable and inaccurate. Lawmakers say they'll use the upcoming defense policy bill to address this memo. And as part of the Air Force's Skyborg program, hold up, that was actually really cool to say. The service wants to team the F-35 and the F-15EX with the new XQ-58 Valkyrie and other wingman drones. It's part of the Air Force's plan to incorporate AI and unmanned systems into future aerial combat. While the implementation is still way off, Acquisition Chief Dr. Will Roper is very passionate about the project and sees a lot of potential for it to revolutionize the entire Air Force. The U.S. Army has picked 5 companies to come up with designs to integrate a new 30mm gun as part of a drive to make its Stryker fleet more lethal. General Dynamics Land Systems, Colesman Inc., Leonardo DRS, Raytheon, and Pratt & Miller Integration have all been awarded $150,000 contracts to come up with plans. The Army's goal is to get a brigade equipped with the UP-gun vehicles by 2022, and after the first 3 brigades are equipped, the Army says they'll study if they want to arm even more of them. And without an air wing, an aircraft carrier is pretty useless. So what should those air wings look like in the future as the nature of war changes? I recently asked that question the naval strategist Bryan Clark from the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, who authored an excellent study on the topic. Here's our interview. All right, Bryan, thanks for talking with us today about your study with the future of the carrier air wing. So first of all, looking back at what you said, was there one thing that struck you most about the most desperate need in the carrier air wing of the future versus what we have today?
Yeah, Jeff, thanks a lot for having me on today. And I think the most desperate need for the air wing is a longer range unmanned platform. One thing we found in our study was that the current air wing lacks the range to be able to do something relevant in an area where the carrier is going to be able to operate and generate sorties. I mean, I think one thing people forget is that even with all the efforts we've made to defend the carrier from anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, submarines, those are all going to force the carrier to operate in an area where it's maybe 1,000 miles away from the coast if it's going to be able to generate sorties and avoid these threats. At that range, you're going to need something longer than the F-35, which has a 700-mile radius, or certainly the F-18, which has a 600-mile radius. So a longer range aircraft is absolutely essential if the carrier is going to continue to be a contributor to future strike operations or future maritime operations in general. And because of the endurance of some of these operations that we envisioned in the study, you get to an unmanned aircraft as being necessary, because simply having a long-range manned aircraft doesn't get you that much when the endurance of your average pilot is between 8 and 12 hours. And
so you're hitting beyond, you're talking mission length beyond
right,
that. That's unheard of for carriers.
Yeah, exactly. So well, if you've got a limited number of aircraft, you need every one of them to do as much time in the air as you can. So each time you launch an aircraft, it can't be for a 3 or 4 hour sortie. It's going to have to be for like a 12-hour sortie or a 14-hour sortie, in which case you're kind of beyond what a pilot can be reasonably expected to do, especially in a small tactical aircraft. So you can, even though you could refuel an F-35 multiple times to generate that kind of length of an air patrol, you're just not going to be effective at that kind of duration. So yes, we saw the unmanned aircraft that can carry as much, if not more, payload than the F-35, but have this endurance with refueling to get out to 18 hours perhaps. Flight duration was absolutely essential, because at those ranges it's going to take you 2 hours just to get out to 1,000 miles away from the carrier and do anything, whether it's a combat air patrol for air defense, or it's a strike operation, or it's anti-ship operations against enemy surface combatants. All of those things are going to take a lot longer than they do today, because you're taking 2 hours out, 2 hours back just to get to the mission area. So you need another several hours on station to do something useful, which means now I'm into probably an unmanned aircraft.
So looking at carrier decks in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the early 80s, it was a pretty diverse mix, almost like a zoo of different aircraft.
Yeah.
You look at a carrier deck today, you see Hornet tails,
it's
and
homogeneous.
that's pretty much it.
Right.
Do you see the carrier wing of the future being looking like the 50s, 60s, 70s, very different looking?
Not at all, right? It's going to need to be much more heterogeneous, to use those terminology. So because today's air wing is pretty much all F-18EFs, so Super Hornets, and it's a luxury we had in the post-Cold War time frame, because we didn't need an aircraft that was particularly good at air defense or particularly good at strike. We could have a jack of all trades that was able to do all of those things, do it less expensively, have a limited number of parts and limited number of logistics trains I needed, so it was inexpensive and efficient. That's not going to be the case when you go up against great powers like Russia and China. They've got the kind of air threats that we need to have an air defense fighter probably to address. They need the long-range strike operations to be done to take care of surface ships or to attack targets ashore. And those are things that the F-18 is not well suited for. It's not fast enough or maneuverable enough to be really a good dogfighter. It can't generate the kind of payload on station that an F-35 might need to be able to do, but you need maybe an unmanned strike aircraft to do. And it certainly can't give you the mission duration you need for some of these long duration combat air patrols that are necessary to defend the carrier or targets ashore from the air.
And in general, you've got an old fleet.
Right.
There may be new ones coming, but you've got in general an older fleet with with technology that at its base comes from the 1970s and 80s, which is not exactly what the other thing you addressed there was an air defense fighter. You addressed in this the need for urgently, I believe the Navy's terminology is FAXX, and how urgent that need is. Do you see that actually happening anytime soon with the way the Navy is going right now?
So what I think is likely to happen is that the Navy's going to, instead of pursuing like a 6th generation fighter like the Air Force has talked about for their penetrating counter-air aircraft, the Navy's going to probably step back and do something that's more oriented towards air defense. So it's going to be an aircraft that's have a longer range, longer endurance, maybe better maneuverability and better speed than their current generation of strike fighters, but is not necessarily a generational advancement above current technology. So I could see them taking the F-35 and making a modified version of that to become FAXX. So that requires some modest investment in the non-recurring engineering to make that happen, but you could save a lot of money on the back end because you're not developing something from scratch.
And that was going to be my question, because you and I both know defense acquisition in this country. Developing things from scratch is not exactly what the United States does well in that regard lately.
Right. Well, and you look at what the Navy's done with its own strike fighters. So the F-18 Hornet gave birth to the Super Hornet, gave birth to the Growler. You could see a similar evolution happening in the F-35 family, where you've got the Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, but you could also have variants of the Charlie that are maybe more fighter focused, maybe more electronic warfare focused. So even though the Navy's building Block 3 Super Hornets and is building some Block 2 Growlers, there's going to come a point where those technologies are limited by the airframe in which they're housed. And so you need to maybe have an air defense aircraft that's a little bit better, a little faster, a little longer range than the current generation. And that would be a good pairing with this unmanned combat air vehicle, which would do a lot of your long-range attack missions, or be your payload carrier to support an F-35 that's doing your ISR and command and control mission. So
speaking on the unmanned vehicles, the Navy's working on the MQ-25, but they're very vocal that is they are very excited about getting that into the air wing. but they're doing 4 per air wing and a refueling capacity only. Do you see that as a lack of interest, or more of a get feet on the ground, do this, figure out how to integrate it in the wing, and then go big?
I think, certainly. I think it's certainly a crawl, walk, run sort of approach. They want to get enough of them to where they can get them out there, do some experimentation, build the ConOps, and then start building them in serial production so that you can get an adequate number per air wing. Because in our study, and what we calculated was, you're going to need, if you want to take all of your strike fighters out to the 1,000-mile point that the Navy's identified as sort of the milestone they want to reach, you're going to need about 12 of these MQ-25s or 14. You're going to need at least a dozen of them in the air wing to be able to facilitate that, because each one can really only get 2 strike fighters out to 1,000 miles.
Right, and so when you multiply it out via 2 squadron strike or something like that.
So if you take into account operational availability and all that, you're really going to need at least a dozen of these MQ-25s if you want the whole strike fighter wing to be able to go out to 1,000 miles and do something, whether it's drop bombs or do a combat air patrol or whatever. So they need a lot more of them if they're going to buy the MQ-25 as their future tanker. And then if they bought 12 per air wing, then you could look at other ways to use them. They could look at ways of using them for ISR. They could use them for strike missions in areas where maybe it's more permissive, so that their radar cross-section, their survivability will be adequate. So I think there's a lot of applications for that MQ-25 beyond maybe just the tanker mission that the Navy's originally envisioned.
All right, and finally, looking as we wrap up, we're looking at how the willingness of the Navy to get involved in such a radical change, because Naval Aviation has embraced the Super Hornet, telling the Naval Aviation that they have to move away from the Super Hornet. It's long-term, yes. Short-term may present some problems. Do you see the willingness in the Navy to make the changes like what you're suggesting to reach the point that they need?
I think the Navy will be willing to do that. I think they can see the kind of end of the road eventually coming for the Super Hornet or the Hornet family of aircraft. They're buying some more Block 3s right now, which are really to fill inventory gaps that exist today. But if you look at the air wing of 2040, which is the time frame we looked at, and that's the time frame the Navy looks at as well when they're thinking of what does my future air wing look like. By 2040, most of these aircraft will have aged out, unless you want to buy another generation of Hornets, which is unlikely. And also some of your initial F-35s will be aging out as well.
Heaven forbid we're thinking of an F-35 aging out of service.
Right, so in the 2040 time frame, which is kind of that next big milestone for the Navy's carrier air wing, your F-35s will be at the midpoint in their overall lifespan. So you should be thinking about what is going to replace them. They've got some inherent limitations in terms of payload endurance. They're manned. There's things that the Navy's going to have to do to augment them to enable the carrier air wing to remain relevant in an environment where it's all about survivability, range, and payload. And so I think that's going to be a necessity. And the F-18s will have largely aged out by then.
All right, great. Brian, thanks for the time. I really do
appreciate
this. Is
it. Thank you very much. Great to see you.
To keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also, be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. And when we come back, we'll look at a critical nuclear security mission that could be in jeopardy. When you think of the National Nuclear Security Administration, you don't always think of aircraft. But in fact, the organization owns several fixed and rotary wing aircraft to survey radiation from the air. But those aircraft are aging, and the demands on them are only increasing. So I went up to Joint Base Andrews to get a look. This helicopter is one of only 2 owned by the National Nuclear Security Administration, used to monitor and track radiation from the air. They do that by flying over radiological emissions and logging them, which allows the creation of a map showing those sources.
We deploy the helicopter right as a security bubble is being established around a major public event. So whether or not it's the president or the vice president coming to talk, or it's the Super Bowl or the Daytona 500, something that might be of such high visibility and prominence that someone may decide to try to do something about it, and may try to bring in a radiological dispersal device or something like that. And oftentimes in a city, you'll find at a hospital or a cancer treatment center, and so that will pop up depending on the location of the source and what it's in. That will show, and it will allow then the local and/or the federal officials to determine that in fact it should be there.
The helicopter also is capable of flying low and slow. And so with this capability, we're able to get the most detailed characterization of radiological contamination on the ground from the air that's achievable.
And these helicopters aren't the only aircraft operated by the NNSA, as the organization also flies fixed-wing aircraft, which are in the process of being replaced now, with Textron under contract to do so. But the helicopters are also in need of replacement, both because of their age and their design.
These helicopters, while expertly maintained, are getting pretty long in the tooth. I think the average is about 26 years old. The big problem is that it'll begin to cut into readiness. The older the airframe gets, the more that the unanticipated maintenance will occur. And oftentimes, given that we only have one on either coast of the rotary wing, if one goes down, then that's a capability that we kind of lose until we can fix it.
When it comes to the design, they lack certain capabilities that are needed to execute their mission.
The location of the sensors outside of the fuselage actually invokes a little bit of problem. On cold or hot days, if you're traveling in a certain pattern, the temperature delta between the detectors have to then be modified in the software and all that. I think one of our goals is to try to get those sensors inside the fuselage. We can't put them inside the fuselage of the Bell Huey because the fuel tank is under, and that would actually kind of interfere with the ability to detect.
The new aircraft, we will be able to incorporate more modern capabilities. For example, these aircraft right now do not have any sort of video monitoring capability, so we rely on static satellite imagery when we create our map products. Well, that's not really the state of the art for aerial surveys, right? So being able to have a camera, just a visual camera, will be a significant upgrade in our capability. It's important that you understand what's on the ground as you're flying over it when you're taking the data.
But as for how they'll replace them, the NNSA says they plan to hold a full and open competition, contingent on funding from Congress.
There are several types out there that we believe would meet the mark. And clearly the Bell 412 EPI is in the running, just like I think the Augusta Westland has a model that's in the running. And of course, Sikorsky. There may be some others. So we're going to be doing a full and fair competition to try to determine which will be the right one and get that right price point.
But at the end of the day, while there's no doubt as to the importance and national security implications of the aerial monitoring mission, it's a mission that could be in jeopardy, particularly as its helicopters age. At Joint Base Andrews, Jeff Martin, Defense News. Coming up, we'll hear directly from a mysterious Air Force figure, a colonel known as Ned Stark. Stay tuned. On this week's Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Jeanette Mack offers her latest tips.
With summer around the corner, everyone is eager for the same thing, a vacation. Who doesn't love a nice escape, especially if you've been on active duty for a long stretch? Ideally, when you're on vacation, your only mission should be de-stressing and having fun. But studies show that 1 in 5 Americans will go into debt just to pay for a summer vacation. To keep your time off affordable and ultimately less stressful, you've got to plan ahead and, of course, budget. To be smart about buying flights or train tickets, try to use credit card points for what you can, even car rentals and hotels. Maybe make it a road trip if your destination isn't too far away, or staying with nearby family to avoid hotel costs. Also, just like you do at home, don't eat out every night. Go to a grocery store and cook, and pack snacks too. You'd be amazed at how much you pay at restaurants for drinks, dinner, and tips for 3 meals a day. Sometimes it's the small things that make a huge difference in your budget and the overall cost of your trip. Keep your vacations affordable and fun, so when you come back, you won't have lots of debt, but you will have some great memories.
Thanks, Jeanette. To get more Defense News coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our Early Bird Brief, delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And coming up, we'll hear directly from a mysterious Air Force figure, a colonel known as Ned Stark. Stay tuned. In May of 2018, an anonymous writer known as Ned Stark took the Air Force by storm, criticizing long-standing policy while offering his own ideas. Now that writer, Colonel Jason Lamb, is revealing himself. Here's Steve Losey's report.
Last year, an anonymous officer known only as Colonel Ned Stark rocked the Air Force with his columns, arguing that the way the service chooses its leaders has gone terribly wrong. And now, Ned Stark has revealed himself. He's Colonel Jason Lamb, a career intelligence officer at Air Education and Training Command, and he sat down with Air Force Times for his first ever videotaped interview. So you are Colonel Ned Stark.
Yes.
For the last year, you've been writing articles in War on the Rocks and Air Force Times about your concerns about the Air Force's officer development and promotion process. Tell us how you got here.
I reached a point as a sitting group commander, just watching what was happening with the promotion system and how we were promoting and how we were selecting folks. and came away with the conclusion that while this was okay, there were some issues with it, and I really felt like we could do better. Talking with some of my peers, it was kind of clear that I wasn't the only one who felt this way, but everybody else I was talking with kind of felt powerless. You know, this is the system we have. What are we going to do? So I was sitting there thinking about it, and it occurred to me, I'm going to write an article. My friends were pretty evenly divided. My friends said, don't publish this at all. You're a sitting group commander. There's no way you should do this. And then there were the other folks who said, this is really important. We think you should do this, but you cannot do this under your true name.
So why Ned Stark?
So it didn't start off as Ned Stark. I actually was suffering from some delusions of grandeur and referenced back to some key historical figures, but it was pointed out to me by one of my friends that I was an uber nerd and that nobody would know who those people were. But he knew we're both Game of Thrones fans, and he's like, since you're going to end up losing your head over this, you might as well go with Ned Stark.
So you're an Air Force colonel who is a sitting group commander talking about all these things that have only been whispered about. What did you expect would happen, and what actually did happen?
So I had no idea what would happen. Most of the lines in Vegas, you know, if my friends had anything to say with it, you know, described my career demise within a week or two.
But Lamb's career didn't end. Instead, Ned Stark's arguments went viral, sparked hard conversations across the Air Force, and even reached the upper echelons of the Pentagon. People as far up as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force began to hear what he had to say.
Not everything with the system is bad. It does promote some really great officers, but unfortunately we promote, I think, more than we need to, folks who don't need to be promoted to that next level. What's disappointing to me is the lack of accountability for what our promotion system has produced. The system really has lent itself towards identifying way too early the folks that are going to be our lieutenant colonels, colonels, and generals, just because it's in a very aggressive timeline.
One of Lamb's key arguments is that the Air Force fast-tracks promising young officers for early promotion and command, but if they later prove flawed, they don't get removed. At the same time, late-blooming officers who could develop into good leaders never get the chance.
So when someone, for example, as a captain who's an executive officer or an aide to a general officer gets a tremendous ranking, a stratification, and that person, as a very junior company grade officer, receives extra consideration for job placement, and they're placed in positions of higher responsibility than their peers, and everybody knows who receives one of these officers. Oh, this is someone on the fast track. This was General so-and-so's exec or aide. So there's a real hesitance in the system to look at that person objectively.
And what happens when someone like that, they make mistakes, or they tank the morale of a unit, or do other things that might otherwise end the career of someone else?
Sure. They become, instead of career ending, they become teachable moments.
So what do you think the Air Force can do to try to get at some of the issues that you started talking about?
The system, as we talked about, any system can be gamed. It's more important to fix the culture and have a culture that is intolerant of toxic individuals or people who've been promoted beyond their competency levels and their capability.
With his possible retirement looming, Lamb hopes the Air Force will continue having these hard conversations and take the bold steps needed to grow the next generation of leaders. As far as his own future, he doesn't have any regrets about sticking his neck out to improve the service he loves.
I think I've accomplished all that I can accomplish as Ned Stark, and it's time to close out that chapter. There's only so much you can do as someone anonymous, publishing and working through email. now's a time when I'm ready to engage as a person to person, and help where I can.
And what do you think is going to happen tomorrow and the day after you reveal who you are?
You know, my failure to accurately predict what was going to happen after the first article, I'm not going to try and guess what's going to happen. I really don't think there are going to be negative consequences, though. And in terms of, you know, the future or jobs or those kinds of things, I'm not sure I would want to work for somebody who had an issue with what I wrote. Because I'm a candid individual. Anybody I've worked with my entire career will tell you I'm extremely candid. So they don't want me to work for them anyway, because I'm going to give them the truth and my very best.
That's all we have time for this week, but if you want to see and read more, be sure to head over to defensenews.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.